president, you have some really, really good friends, convinced him that his memoirs would sell extremely well. Got him a publisher, got him a good advance, and Grant sat down and read his memoirs, racing the clock and in incredible pain, and heavily medicated much of the time. He couldn't take morphine because it made him too groggy to work, so he took cocaine instead, which of course inhibited him from sleeping very much. And he finished his memoirs only a few days before he passed away. That's all very dramatic, and I applaud his courage. The problem is, he did in his memoirs what almost everybody does in their memoirs, which is they pass on the story that they would like people to know. The problem with that is, as historian Dave Powell has said, Dave's a good friend of mine, memoirs are not historical documents. They're one person's view of history, and it's their perspective. And it's certainly worth reading Grant's memoirs. They're very well written, and obviously he's a witness to some incredible historical events. The problem is when we take only his word for what happened, we get misled. Everybody's the hero of their own memoirs. Winston Churchill was, Ulysses S. Grant was. So what we need to do is step back a little bit and listen to what some of the other witnesses from the Civil War had to say. Okay, if we could see the next slide, please. Okay, this actually should be just General Ulysses S. Grant. The Major General is improper given the rank he's wearing. But as I say, I mean, when I started this research quite a long time ago, 24 years ago, I was quite a Grant fan. And doing the first book, some of the luster came off that. The first book looks largely at his relationship with General William S. Rosecrans, to whom he was very unfair at the time and later in his memoirs. But when I finished it, I said, well, there's personality clashes. They happen all the time. Maybe it's a kind of a one-shot deal. But when I started looking for the second book into Grant's relationship with several other Civil War generals, I discovered a pattern of behavior that was really very disturbing. Grant wasn't really telling us the truth all the time. Well, people do that. They're not always honest, particularly in things like memoirs. The problem is too many historians have accepted what Grant said as simply being true, what he said is the truth, and they've just gone on from there without looking at other sources. And I think it's only fair that we do that. Let's see what some of the other people had to say about themselves. Next slide, please. Okay, the first battle I examined in book one was the Battle of Shiloh. I'm not going to spend a lot of time lingering over it. Essentially, the important thing that came out of this, and I titled that chapter "A Pattern of Deceit Emerges." The thing is that Grant went to his grave denying that he had been surprised at the Battle of Shiloh. I think most historians Civil War historians will say, yes, he was surprised, and they sort of like scoff a little bit at it. Like, well, he was not real being honest here. Well, okay, that's fine. Let's accept that. But if that's the case, if we know he was dishonest here, maybe we need to be a little more selective about what we believe from Grant's accounts of things. He claimed that he actually said in a letter to his father, which wound up in the newspapers, we could not have been more prepared for them had they informed us 3 days in advance that they were coming, which of course begs multiple questions. Then why was his army not entrenched? Why was he not actively patrolling? And why, when the attack came, was Grant 8 miles away up on the other side of the river, not in telegraph communication with his army? There's a whole lot more to the Battle of Shiloh, and I discussed it. It's got its own chapter in book one. But the point I want to make here is simply that if, in this case, Grant's not telling us the truth, then why do we just assume he's telling us the truth in other instances? Okay, next slide, please. Forgive my voice a little bit, too. I've been recovering from bronchitis. This is General William S. Rosecrans, who's part of the, he's the major character, he and Grant, in book one. This whole thing came about because I had a very simple question. I was wondering why William Rosecrans was the only Union major general, of whom there were quite a few, who didn't have a statue. The guy was an army commander in 5 battles, 4 of which he won. He lost the Battle of Chickamauga. And yet there was no statue of him anywhere. And when I did some research, I discovered that during the war, he was viewed by many people, including Lincoln early on, as basically on a par with Grant. He was very well thought of by the Union High Command, by the press, by Congress, and yet today he's largely forgotten. And I was wondering why that was. So did my research, wrote my book, discovered a lot of things that surprised me. William Rosecrans now has a statue. It's in his hometown of Sunbury, Ohio, about 30 miles north of Columbus. My wife and I were there for the dedication of the statue, as were 41 Rosecrans descendants, some of whom had to be convinced to attend because they were actually embarrassed to be associated with him, which is really a shame. They named us honorary Rosecranses, which was really kind of nice. And a couple of weeks later, I was flying to Chicago to do a presentation, and a young woman was seated next to me, and she kept looking at me, and that made me a little uneasy. I'm not used to women staring at me. And finally she said, "I'm sorry, this is going to sound strange, but is your name Varney, Frank Varney?" And I said, "Yeah." She said, "So nice to meet you." And her last name was Rosecrans. She had read the book. So anyway, I have a higher regard for William S. Rosecrans than I had before I began my research. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is obviously a modern map. The interstate highway system didn't exist in 1862, but it was a quick map to find. It just basically gives you a geographical layout of three important actions. Towards the top of the screen, you see the Battle of Shiloh, Red Star. Shiloh was fought because the Union Army under Grant was advancing on Corinth, which was a key railroad hub in northern Mississippi. After Shiloh, when Grant was surprised, Henry Halleck replaced him. Halleck's taken a lot of grief from historians for supposedly undercutting Grant, but it appeared to me in my research that actually he sort of covered for him because Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War, demanded to know of Halleck what went wrong, and he specifically asked, was Grant drinking again? Because Grant had a problem with alcohol in the old army before the war. Halleck said that he was not, although, it's hard to say really, but Halleck said no. And he assumed command of the army, conducted a very ponderous advance, eventually took Corinth, and then Halleck was called east to assume overall command of the war effort, and Grant was left in charge. And that led to the Battle of Iuka. That's the Red Star down towards the, sort of down into the right from Corinth. We'll talk about that in a moment. If you could bring the next slide, please. Okay, here's Iuka. Now, Iuka is south and east of Corinth. It was occupied by Confederate General Sterling Price, and Rosecrans and Grant cooked up a plan between them to get control of Iuka. And the plan was Grant, with about more than half of the army under the direct command of Edward Ord, would advance from the west on Iuka and draw the Confederates' attention that way. Rosecrans would make a wide swing to the south and approach Iuka from that direction. And in doing that, he would be able to cut the only two good roads out of Iuka besides the one that Grant and Ord were advancing on. So they should, in theory, have Price trapped. The problem is Grant got about 8 miles away from Iuka, the town of Burnsville, and stopped. Just stopped. Rosecrans, of course, didn't know that was going on. He continued his advance, and another thing went wrong. Rosecrans discovered, once he started his movement on Iuka, that the two roads he was to cover were much more widely separated than they had been led to believe. And there's no GPS back then, so they didn't have very good maps. And the ground between the two roads was really terrible. So if he had advanced his columns on the two roads as the original plan called for, against a much larger Confederate force, that would have outnumbered him close to 2-1 if it was fully concentrated on him. Fortunately for him, it didn't. But one column could not have come to the aid of the other. So he came up with an alternate plan. He would advance on the one road until he got, you can see on the map there's a road that cuts across. It's called the Bay Springs Road. At that point, he would swing part of his column east, and then he could occupy the two roads he was supposed to occupy. That probably would have worked, except that Grant and Ord simply stopped. So Price was able to send enough troops to face Rosecrans to prevent him from clearing the Bay Springs Road in time to prevent Price from getting out of Iuka and escaping. Grant submitted 2 reports of the Battle of Iuka. In the first one, he did not blame Rosecrans at all. He said that he agreed with Rosecrans' decision after he had examined the ground. He didn't think there was anything else he really could have done. There was no fault to be laid at the feet of General Rosecrans, who conducted his share of the operation quite well. Then, about a month later, he sent another report, much more critical of Rosecrans, and we'll talk more a little bit about that. in a moment. So if we can have the next slide, please. Okay. Grant then divided his force. He left the largest percentage of it in Corinth, the whole Corinth, under the command of Rosecrans. He had Sherman in Memphis with a part of the force. Sherman, of course, on the river in Memphis could be supported by the Confederate gunboats. Excuse me, Stephen Hurlbut had another force in the town of Bolivar, and Grant had the rest of it in Jackson, Tennessee. And Price, now reinforced by Confederate General Earl Van Dorn and his army, they attacked Corinth. As you can see from the map, Rosecrans' command was forced back and back and back into the town, into a line of redoubts he had built there. It was a very, very tough fight. Rosecrans was again outnumbered. In fact, an interesting thing, for those of you who study the Civil War much, which I imagine is a good chunk of your audience, would certainly be aware that generally speaking, in battles between Union and Confederacy, the Union has a preponderance of force. That was pretty much never the case with Rosecrans. He was sometimes outnumbered, and at best, if he did have an advantage, it was quite minor. He was usually at the very best about equivalent to Confederate forces, and several times he was outnumbered. He was outnumbered here. He finally did manage to get some support. Grant sent a force under John McPherson, and the Confederates withdrew. Rosecrans led a pursuit, as he had after Iuka. And as had been the case after Iuka, Grant recalled him from the pursuit over the objections of Rosecrans, and then later in his reports and in his memoirs blamed Rosecrans for not pursuing, when in fact he had. And yet historians basically just take Grant's word for it all. I give examples of this in the book, in book 1, so I'm not going to go through them here. But there's multiple occasions where this happens. They just simply take as gospel what Grant said. So again, Rosecrans acquitted himself fairly well. Next slide, please. Okay, I mentioned before about the 2 reports Grant submitted of the Battle of Iuka. I usually ask audiences, would you buy a used car from this man? This is Union Colonel Mortimer Leggett. Leggett sent, between the Battle of Iuka and the second report Grant sent, Leggett sent a letter to Grant's then Chief of Staff, John Rawlins. And really, the editor of the book cleaned up the letter a bit, and I kind of wish he hadn't. I think it would have been enlightening to leave it in the original format. It was, the spelling was intensely creative. Random acts of capitalization everywhere. And it looked like somebody dropped a box of commas on the page. They were just placed haphazardly throughout. And he claimed in there that reports that were appearing in the Ohio newspapers, particularly in Cincinnati, that Grant had been drunk during the Battle of Iuka, that those reports had originated from Rosecrans, or at least from his headquarters. There is no proof that it's true, and he offered none. He even said, I'm not there, so I don't really know. But this is what I tend to suspect. Now, whether it was true or not, and it may have been, but there's no proof that it was, doesn't really matter. The point is that Grant apparently believed that Rosecrans was responsible, and it really poisoned their relationship. There were other factors too, but I think this was a big one, because only a couple days later, Grant sent the second report of the Battle of Iuka, in which he was highly critical of Rosecrans, and he made some comments in that report that were almost word for word what Leggett had said in the letter he sent to Rawlins. So I think this otherwise rather relatively inconspicuous officer may have been responsible for a rather important feud among Civil War generals. Next slide, please. Okay, so a few other things. Rosecrans now finds himself out from under Grant's command. Oh, by the way, one more thing. Battle of Iuka. There were reports I mentioned that Grant had been drunk in command. I think they may very well have been true. I was shocked to discover there is a period of 40 hours in which not a single order leaves Grant's headquarters, written order, over Grant's signature. The only messages Rosecrans gets comes from one of Grant's staff officers, who then mounts up with another officer and rides 23 miles to Rosecrans' column to find out what's supposed to happen next. He just came from Grant's headquarters. You'd think he would know. So there's something very strange going on there. I don't know if Grant was drunk, if he was sick, or what it was, but something very odd was going on. A period of 40 hours in which he was not communicating with Rosecrans' column at all. Okay, Rosecrans now has an independent command, which he names the Army of the Cumberland. He's holding Nashville. He's when he took the army over from Don Carlos Buell, the morale was quite poor. Supply was really in bad shape. He had to resupply the army, get to prepare it for a campaign. While that was happening, Braxton Bragg, Confederate Army of Tennessee, moved towards Nashville, and Rosecrans met him at Stones River and won a victory. It was a very hard-fought battle. At the time, it was considered an important victory, certainly by Lincoln, who wrote Rosecrans a letter that said, at a time when the nation sorely needed a victory, you gave us one. Rosecrans was voted the thanks of both houses of Congress and of several state legislatures. And yet today, it's largely overlooked. Why? Well, one reason could be later in the war, when Grant was general-in-chief, he was at a meeting in Lincoln's cabinet, and Lincoln referred to Stones River as a victory, and Grant interrupted President Lincoln and said Stones River was not a victory. Lincoln said, "On that, you and I will have to disagree." It's referred to, when you read most books on Stones River, it generally turns out to be referred to as either a bloody draw, or if it was a victory, it sort of seemed to happen without much input from Rosecrans. One historian even says he dashed madly about the battlefield, red-faced and sweating, shouting orders that his subordinates ignored. Well, that's interesting, because if you read the reports and the after action reports, the letters and the journals of the men who were there, and I've looked at hundreds of them, he's mentioned over and over again by his men, and references to things like, at last we have a general who we're confident in, or this was good generalship. After Rosecrans died, one of the officers who'd been there, who later was Speaker of the House of Representatives, said, "I can see him as if it were just today, as if he were a god of battle." This doesn't sound like a commanding officer whose officers' subordinates routinely ignored him. An interesting thing, when the first book came out, and I was at Stones River National Battlefield Park to a book signing, and it was a lull period. I took a little break, and I walked through the museum. It was fairly new at that time. And you know how they have the text plaques and the photos and things on the wall? I was walking through reading it, and in the run-up to the battle, Rosecrans is featured prominently. Then the battle starts, and his name was not mentioned at all. For all the plaques that were up there to discuss the battle, Rosecrans never is mentioned. It's like the battle happened without him somehow. Then the battle is over, and there he is again. Well, I mentioned this on C-SPAN. And the next time I went to Stones River, his name was mentioned in at least a few of those plaques. I don't know if I had anything to do with it. Probably some other historians had noted the same thing. But it did seem odd that the Army commander at this battle didn't get a mention at the Battlefield Museum. Okay, next slide, please. Tullahoma Campaign. Rosecrans in this basically maneuvered Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee out of their namesake state. And really a brilliant campaign, which has been taught in a number of European military academies as an example of how to organize and plan a campaign. It's largely ignored, not because of any dark conspiracy, simply bad timing. It took place at the end of June 1863. And then, of course, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 1863 is the Battle of Gettysburg, and July 4th, Vicksburg surrenders to Grant. Rosecrans himself said after the war that the Tullahoma campaign would be forgotten because it was not, as he put it was not written in letters of blood. But it is a shame. It really was extremely well done. And he did it with minimal casualties. Next slide, please. Okay, Chickamauga. This was Rosecrans' only real defeat. He was outnumbered. First of all, he was supposed to have cooperation. He was advancing on Chattanooga. That was the goal of the campaign. He was supposed to be supported by Ambrose Burnside, who with his Ninth Corps was in a semi-independent position at Knoxville. Burnside had repeated orders from General-in-Chief Halleck, even from Abraham Lincoln, to go to the assistance of Rosecrans. In fact, one of them said, "Go to the assistance of General Rosecrans with all the force you can spare. I cannot make this any clearer." And he never moved, not a mile. Grant, who had captured Vicksburg by this time, was supposed to operate on Rosecrans' strategic right to prevent the Confederates from sending reinforcements, and he never moved. He later claimed, Grant did, that the telegraph was down between his headquarters in Washington for an entire week, and that's why he didn't move. He didn't get the order. I'm sorry, but I find it difficult to believe that no one in Washington would have noticed that there was no telegraphic communication with Grant's headquarters for an entire week. It just boggles the imagination. But at any rate, Rosecrans was outnumbered. It was a tactical defeat. He made a mistake. He issued an order that was supposed to plug a gap and instead accidentally opened one because he'd been given the wrong information. But, it did accomplish the objective. At the end of the battle, he still held Chattanooga, which is what the intent of the campaign had been. It was not nearly the route it's often depicted as. You read accounts by Charles Dana, Assistant Secretary of War, who was there, who's fired off this telegram in the immediate aftermath of the battle, actually while it was still going on, that it was a terrible day, it was a disaster, that Rosecrans is probably captured, if not dead, most of the army is routed, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the one that appears in the history books. But a few hours later, he sent another telegram basically saying, okay, I was wrong. Things aren't nearly as bad. And he went through and straightened it all out. But for some reason, that telegram doesn't get a lot of play. The one that claims Rosecrans' army was smashed and that Rosecrans fled the battlefield and abandoned his army. Those are the ones they keep hearing up the history books. There are 4 supposed eyewitness accounts that Rosecrans ran. None of them are credible. One of the people who's quoted, Jacob Cox, wasn't there. Another one, Charles Dana, later apologized to Rosecrans for his mistake in saying it. James Garfield, who was Rosecrans' chief of staff at Chickamauga, later recanted. And the other one, Captain Alfred Lacey Huff, never said it. Apparently his son said it years later, but he was not at the Battle of Chickamauga. Huff's after-action reports, letters, and the journal he wrote that night say exactly the opposite, that Rosecrans was cool, calm, and collected, firing off orders. So there is no evidence, credible evidence, that Rosecrans fled the battlefield. He essentially did at Chickamauga the same thing that Grant did at Shiloh. At Shiloh, Grant went to where the action was hot, told his commanders to hold, and fell back to supposedly rally his army at the river. Rosecrans left part of his army under George H. Thomas holding and went back to Chattanooga to rally his troops. And yet he gets accused of fleeing the battlefield, and Grant does not. If one is not correct, then neither is the other. Grant later relieves Rosecrans. He's given the authority to do so by Stanton, and it leaves him for no valid reason. Grant claims that the army was starving, the Army of the Cumberland. Supposedly, according to many history books, Grant takes command of the Army of the Cumberland, within a few days opens the Cracker Line and saves the army, opens a supply line. Here's the problem with that. I found written evidence in multiple instances in the letters and journals and reports of the men and the officers of the Army of the Cumberland referring to the Cracker Line by that name more than a week before the relief of Rosecrans. It was already up and running. But Grant has got the credit for opening it. He claimed that Rosecrans was about to abandon Chattanooga. He said he had a telegram from Charles Dana that said that, except that Rosecrans, when he demanded to see the telegram, was never produced, and Dana denied having sent it. And yet there it is in the history books. There was no valid reason for the relief of Rosecrans. Again, book 1 goes into a great deal more detail than I'm giving you today. But there's a whole lot more to the story of the Battle of Chickamauga than we've been told. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, finishing up Rosecrans. He's later reassigned by Lincoln to the Department of Missouri over the objection of Grant. Grant stripped Rosecrans of most of his effective troops, in spite of the fact Rosecrans had sent him a message warning him that Sterling Price was about to launch a major raid into Missouri. Now, Grant, I can't blame Grant completely for this. Grant had made another mistake, which we're going to address down the road, which resulted in John Bell Hood's invasion of Tennessee. And George H. Thomas, who was the person who was going to have to face him, did not have an adequate force. So Grant was pulling troops from every source he could get them from, including Rosecrans. Unfortunately, the timing for Rosecrans, it could not have come at a worse time when he was facing this major raid. But he did finally with assistance from other officers, managed to beat the raid. And then he was removed by Grant for taking too long to do it. So it's, again, we're getting one side of the story, and we're not getting a balanced picture. Next slide, please. Okay, which brings us to book 2. Okay, General Joseph Hooker, Fighting Joe Hooker. Hooker claimed in his memoirs that, Grant claimed in his memoirs that Hooker was always trying to gather other subordinate officers to his side so he could exercise an independent command. Well, that's pretty damning testimony, except when? I mean, in the early stages of the war, he's a division commander and then a corps commander in the Army of the Potomac, and no one there comments that he ever did this. He then goes west and serves under Rosecrans briefly. Rosecrans had no problem with him. He's then part of Sherman's march to Atlanta, the Atlanta campaign. And Sherman complains sort of retroactively about this. He never complains about it at the time. Once Grant complained about it after the war, then Sherman kind of jumped on the bandwagon. But there's really no record of it. The one instance that Sherman cites, he said that Hooker apparently supposedly gave a command to John Schofield, went outside the chain of command. The only problem with that is Schofield denied it ever happened. He said Hooker never presumed to give him a command. And the conversation that Sherman cites, Schofield disputes almost word for word. And Schofield, after the war, is one of the Grant men. So, there's, again, no credible evidence for Grant's claim of what Hooker was supposedly doing. Next slide, please. Okay, Battle of Chancellorsville. This is Hooker's defeat when he's in command of the Army of the Potomac. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it here. It's in book 2. But an interesting point is that the Joint Congressional Committee on the Conduct of the War convened a hearing about this, a court of inquiry to determine what happened. And they came to the conclusion that there were 4 causes of the Union defeat at Chancellorsville, and 3 of them were absolutely not attributable to any mistake of Hooker. Those 3 things were Oliver Otis Howard's refusal, I shouldn't say refusal, his neglect to refuse his flank and to look to his right, in spite of repeated warnings from Hooker that Confederates were moving on the right flank in great strength. That when Hooker sent for John Sedgwick's corps to strike Lee's, the rear of Lee's army as it was facing Hooker, that Sedgwick made a very half-hearted effort. Sedgwick's own officers said as much in their testimony. And finally, Hooker was leaning against a column of the Chancellor House, writing orders, when the column was struck by a cannonball and he was massively concussed. Even General Abner Doubleday, who didn't like him, served under him, didn't like him, said that it was, Hooker was no fault here at all. He said he was in such incredible pain and so dazed that he was simply not able to function. So there's a lot more to the Battle of Chancellorsville than just what we've been told. I love the Ken Burns Civil War series, but some of you may recall that in there, supposedly when Hooker was asked what went wrong at Chancellorsville, he says, "I just lost faith in Joe Hooker." Stephen Sears has done a very good job of putting the lie to that. The officer who supposedly heard Hooker say it was nowhere near Hooker at the time he supposedly said it. I mean, he was miles away. So there is no, and it's certainly out of character for Hooker. And there's no reason for him to have said it. He didn't lose faith in Joe Hooker. He was heavily concussed and badly injured. So he gets blamed for this massive defeat, and it was a defeat, there's no doubt about it, but it wasn't because of any loss of faith in Hooker's part. It was basically a combination of really unfortunate circumstances. Next slide, please. Okay. Hooker is then, after the Battle of Chickamauga, when Rosecrans has fallen back and is holding Chattanooga, which was, after all, the point of the campaign. I was doing a battlefield walk there a number of years ago with historians David Powell, David Moore, and Lee White. Lee has written a number of things about Chickamauga. He's one of the rangers at Chattanooga National Military Park. Dave Powell's written an award-winning 3-volume history of the Battle of Chickamauga. David Moore has written the most recent biography of Rosecrans. And we were leading a battlefield walk, and one of the attendees asked us what, in our opinion, would have been different if Rosecrans had won the Battle of Chickamauga. And we all said, not a whole lot, except he would have probably taken fewer casualties. And the bottom line is he had advanced about as far as he could go with the forces he had, and he held Chattanooga. Now, one of the things he couldn't do when he fell back into Chattanooga was hold Lookout Mountain, which really dominates that whole area. Everyone in Chattanooga, you know what I mean. But supposedly you can see 7 states from there. Well, as part of when Grant relieved Rosecrans and took command himself in Chattanooga, and he was linked up at that, he got the reinforcements he needed, like he got Sherman's 2 corps. Grant devised a plan to break the siege of Chattanooga, and part of it depended on Joe Hooker taking Lookout Mountain. And as you can see, that's a pretty substantial mountain. There's photographs of it in book 2 that kind of give you an idea what it would be like trying to go up that thing. I've been up it several times. I wouldn't want to climb that even with nobody shooting at me. It's Pretty impressive. Hooker took Lookout Mountain. He went up, came down the other side. He was supposed to be a diversionary attack, but he managed to drive the Confederates off the mountain, came down the other side, bridged a ravine that separated Lookout Mountain from the main Confederate position on Missionary Ridge, and began to attack the Confederate left. Next slide, please. Okay, here's Grant's plan. You can see at the top of the screen, Sherman is supposed to hit the right flank of the Confederate forces on Missionary Ridge. Hooker is supposed to threaten the left to make sure that the Confederates can't shift reserves to face Sherman. George H. Thomas, with the Army of the Cumberland, is supposed to simply pose a threat to the Confederate center, again, to pin the center there. The problem is Sherman never got on the Missionary Ridge while there were any Confederates on it. His attack was stymied. The battle was basically going to be just a stalemate until two things happened. One, as I mentioned, Hooker went up and over Lookout Mountain. And secondly, Grant, in trying to hopefully divert some of the Confederate forces from those facing Sherman to the center, ordered Thomas's men forward to take rifle pits at the foot of Missionary Ridge. And they did. They got into those rifle pits, discovered that they were under fire from troops on higher elevation, and without orders, went straight up Missionary Ridge and broke the Confederate defensive line. What won the Battle of Chattanooga was not Grant, it was not Sherman, it was not Hooker, it was not Thomas, it was the men of the Army of the Cumberland who simply exceeded their orders and broke the Confederate center. There's nothing wrong with that. Grant was very good at adapting to changing battlefield conditions. That was one of his strengths. The problem is he always tended to insist that he was operating for some kind of a plan that would have worked just perfectly if his subordinates hadn't screwed it up. We see that happen over and over again. Well, the instance here, what he said, in the face of multiple accounts to the contrary, was he would later rewrite his report to claim that that was his intention all along, that he ordered those troops forward to attack the Confederate center, that Sherman's attack had been intended to draw all the Confederates that way to make it easier for Thomas's men, except that nobody else was privy to that plan, apparently, except Grant. There were multiple eyewitnesses who were with Grant and Thomas on Orchard Knob, where Grant's headquarters was, who they said when those men started up that ridge, Grant was furious. Who ordered those men up that ridge? Thomas, did you order them up? Dodge, did you order them up? Basically, the implication was heads were going to roll, except it worked. Captain Michael Sheridan, the brother of General Phil Sheridan, one of the foremost of the Grant men, who was with that attack, said that it was completely unexpected. One officer tried to order his men back down off the ridge. There's all kinds of accounts, including Phil Sheridan himself, who said that this was not what Grant intended. And yet, that's okay. The bottom line is he won the battle. The problem here is, once again, we see this pattern of deceit. Grant insisting, for beginning shortly after the battle and going on for the rest of his life, that this was his plan all along. Historians, just like they do with Shiloh, they sort of shake their head and laugh. And it's Grant, well, that's fine. But again, now we've known at least two occasions he's lied to us. So shouldn't we take with a grain of salt some of the other things he says about other actions and about other people? So again, it's the pattern that I find really troubling here. Next slide, please. Okay, this is Missionary Ridge from about where Grant's headquarters was. It was much less overgrown at the time. So there was a pretty clear sight line from that position to see troops going up the ridge. But you can see it's a pretty significant landscape feature, would not have been easy to attack. Next slide, please. Okay, which brings us to the Atlanta campaign. Two of the important figures in Sherman's campaign, Grant has gone east. I happen to see Johnson on the screen. Grant has gone east to assume overall command of the war effort, and he's going to start the Overland campaign. Sherman is left in command in the west with three armies, and two people who are very important in the Atlanta campaign are Joe Hooker and George H. Thomas, who we're going to talk more about in a moment. They both perform very well. I'm not going to go into detail about the campaign, except to note, again, there's all this stuff that I'm talking about. There's more details in the book. Much of the heavy fighting, I won't say most, but much of the heavy fighting done in the Atlanta campaign was done by Hooker and his command. And overall, he performed very well. And there's no indication that he expressed any dissatisfaction with the fact that he was not one of the three army commanders until one of them was killed. James B. McPherson. He was shot, killed. Blackjack Logan assumed immediate command on a temporary basis and performed well, but Sherman didn't trust non-West Pointers very much. He wanted a regular officer in command of his three armies. And rather than appoint Hooker, who was the senior officer available in terms of experience, in terms of data commission, and in terms of age, he jumped past Hooker and appointed, of all people, Oliver Otis Howard, the guy who had ignored Hooker's commands at Chancellorsville and led directly to Hooker's defeat there. Hooker was furious and resigned, just walked away, resigned his commission. Okay, Sherman did it. Now, Sherman and Hooker did not get along. Before the war, Sherman at one time had been one of the directors of a bank in San Francisco, and he had a lot of money invested, and Hooker apparently defaulted on a loan and the bank crashed. And Sherman lost a lot of money, so he was really angry with Hooker. But he could not have made the change of an army commander without at least referring it to Grant. And yet Grant claimed that he was quite surprised by it. So Hooker essentially is removed from the equation at this point, just before Atlanta fell. So he gets very little credit for his part in the campaign. Next slide, please. Brings us to George H. Thomas, the famous Rock of Chickamauga. He served under Don Carlos Buell, and Buell viewed him as his most effective corps commander. He served under William S. Rosecrans, who likewise viewed him as far and away his best corps commander. In fact, years later, when someone referred to Thomas as the Rock of Chickamauga, Rosecrans' response was, of course he was the Rock of Chickamauga. He was my rock. They were very close, although they had a little bit of tension when they first started their work together. They eventually overcame it and formed a very solid friendship. They depended upon one another. They got along very well. If you go on pretty much any Civil War roundtable, you go on any online website, pick up any book of the history of the Civil War written before the last couple of years, and what you'll find is references to George H. Thomas. At some point, someone will comment, he was really good, but he was slow. Well, it's interesting because there's no real indication that he was. Buell never complained about it. Rosecrans never complained about it. Actually, Sherman never really complained much about it. After the war, later on in his memoirs, he made a few comments, I think possibly because he knew this is what Grant wanted. Grant could not impugn Thomas's ability. That was not rational. He couldn't impugn his courage either. There were simply too many people who knew better. So what he did, as he did with other officers, if you take a close look and a critical look at his memoirs, he damned him with faint praise. He made comments like, if he had been assigned to command the Confederate armies that Sherman faced, it would have been much more difficult for Sherman's march to the sea. However, he could never have conducted the campaign that Sherman conducted because he was not effective on the attack. He was lethargic. He was slow. He said at one point, we used to joke that General Thomas was too brave to run away and too inert to attack. During the campaign that I mentioned before, when Sherman has launched his march to the sea and John Bell Hood throws a curveball, instead of trying to interfere with Sherman's march, he realizes he probably doesn't have the force to do that. So he tries something else. He launches an invasion, a counter invasion into Tennessee, headed for Nashville. And there's not much there to oppose him. Next slide, please. Okay. Thomas was left behind in spite of his good performance during the Atlanta campaign, in which I might point out, he, again, supposedly is slow, and yet there is no, during the entire Atlanta campaign, you read the reports, he and his men are where they are supposed to be when they are supposed to be there. They're not late, they're not slow, they're where they're supposed to be. Well, then Sherman launches his march from Atlanta to Savannah, and he leaves Thomas behind with what Sherman himself described as the misfits and the walking wounded. He left him with cavalry who didn't have mounts. He left him with artillery that were short of cannon. He left him with men who, some of the cases, weren't armed. He left him with the misfits and the walking wounded to a large degree. And then Hood launches his surprise invasion, catching Sherman and Grant completely off guard. Hood's defeated at Franklin, but the force that defeats him, understandably, doesn't really have sufficient strength to stay there. So Thomas pulls them back at Stanley's request and Schofield's request, who's also there, back to Nashville. Hood advances on Nashville. He doesn't have the force to attack Thomas, so he sort of stops. It's almost like Hood doesn't know what he's going to do next. He's waiting for developments. Well, Grant freaks out at this point. He starts firing off telegrams to Thomas and ordering him to attack. Thomas's response at first is, well, I don't have anything to attack with. I don't even have mounts for my cavalry, and I'm facing Nathan Bedford Forrest. He gets what he needs. Grant is again firing off orders, and Thomas says, I'm working on it. And Hood's not going anywhere. Officers with Thomas, including Schofield, say a telegram to Grant, doesn't seem any real danger. Hood doesn't seem to be ready to attack. If he was going to, he logically would have done so. And doesn't show any signs of retreating. And if he does, we can pursue him. Finally, Thomas gets his ducks in a row and he's ready to attack. And just as he's getting ready, the terrible ice storm comes through. Grant is furious. I ordered you to attack. Thomas says, I can't even get my men in position. I'm having casualties. Men and horses are breaking arms and legs. Arms in the case of the men, horses don't have arms. Just trying to get them into position to attack. They're slipping on the ice. As soon as this clears up, we'll make the attack. Grant dispatches Logan with orders, but if he hasn't attacked by the time you get to Nashville, relieve the command and assume command yourself. And then Grant, against the wishes of Lincoln, gets on a train himself and heads west. Before either of them, Logan or Grant, can reach Nashville, the weather clears, Thomas launches his attack, and in fact inflicts about as one-sided a defeat on Hood as any civil army inflicts on another. It's quite decisive. And here's the interesting thing. Even if he could have attacked sooner, and there's really no good indication that he could have, and he is the commander on the scene, it would be logical to trust his judgment. I mean, he is an accomplished officer. Even if he could have attacked sooner, so what? No negative result came from his supposed lethargy. He launched his attack when he was ready to do so, and he won his battle. He pointed out himself that Grant had spent longer getting ready to launch the Overland campaign than Thomas had spent getting ready to attack Hood. Good point. Next slide, please. Was he slow? Well, again, there's no real indication. There's no real proof that he was. We just have innuendo. He and his men are where they're supposed to be. I mean, he always accomplished what he was ordered to accomplish. And on the whole, he did it very well. Next slide, please. Grant dead with faint praise. And unfortunately, too many historians have just become accustomed to taking Grant at his word. Grant said it, so it must be true. And again, I give countless examples in these two books about this happening. Grant says something, and when you look at what historians say, their footnotes indicate their source was Grant. There's one historian who, in one chapter, I think it was the battles of Corinth and Iuka, he had 39 footnotes. 32 of them, I believe, referred to Grant's memoirs. And of the other 7, 5 referred to Grant's reports in the OR. And the other 2 referred to other historians who used Grant as their source. So 39 footnotes, and essentially they were all Grant. That was his only real source for that chapter. And it's a chapter that praises Grant to the skies. Next slide, please. Okay, which brings us to our final victim, Gouverneur Kemble Warren. One of the really tragic stories of the war. Chief engineer of the Army of the Potomac at one point, one of the heroes of the Battle of Gettysburg. There were many. Later, commander of the 5th Corps, and crosses Grant and pays for it. And it is, as I say, a very sad story. Next slide, please. Okay. The cause of his downfall is this guy, General Ambrose Burnside. William Marvel has done a pretty interesting job at trying to salvage Burnside's reputation as much as it can be. And one of the things that Burnside got blamed for was, I don't think, really his fault. Next slide, please. One of the most visible failures of the war was the Battle of the Crater. Burnside was part of force that was locked in a siege warfare, trench warfare outside Richmond and Petersburg. And Grant was looking for a way to break the deadlock. And Burnside had a suggestion. I have a corps of coal miners, or a division of coal miners in my unit, under the command of an engineer, Henry Pleasance. And Colonel Pleasance has suggested digging a tunnel under the Confederate lines, packing it with gunpowder, and blasting a gap. And then we can send troops through and break the deadlock. It was approved by Grant and Meade with some alterations, because administrators always have to change something to prove that they had something to do with this. So Burnside chose a division, and it was as close to full strength as any division he had. They were spoiling for a fight. They were really ready to go. He pulled them out of the line, and he gave them several days of training, so they knew exactly what they were supposed to do. And then as they moving into position to launch the attack, Meade and Grant discovered that the unit he was planning on using was, in the parlance of the time, a colored unit. And they ordered him not to use those men. Use a white division instead. So he did. And it didn't go well at all. Instead of choosing someone, Burnside had his division commanders draw lots. He apparently was just furious and kind of threw up his hands and washed his hands of the whole affair. It fell to possibly his worst division commander. The attack was simply a tragedy. The men didn't know what they were supposed to do. They went down into the crater, which was not what was planned. They got trapped there and they were butchered. There was a court of inquiry held over it. And one of the people called to give testimony was Governor Kemble Warren. Next slide, please. Okay. I'm putting him up here because I want to remind myself where I'm going with this next part of the story. Warren, during his testimony, was asked directly what went wrong. His Fifth Corps was very near the, it was actually supposed to, after the breakthrough was accomplished, he was then supposed to follow up. But he wasn't supposed to move until the breakthrough was accomplished, and of course it never happened. He was asked what went wrong, and he said the fault was from the lack of an officer at the point of contact with the authority to give orders to all the units involved. Well, George Meade, commander of the Army of the Potomac, was present at the court of inquiry, and he stood up and he said, "Are you accusing me?" And Warren simply repeated word for word what he had said, that the fault was due to the fact that there was no one there with the authority to give orders to all the units involved. Okay, well, if you think about it, the three units involved are one corps of the Army of the James, one corps of the Army of the Potomac, and Burnside's semi-independent Ninth Corps, which was attached to the Army of the Potomac by basically paperwork, because he was superior and seniority to Meade, who was the commander of that army. The only officer with the authority to give commands to all those units would have been the general-in-chief of the army, Ulysses S. Grant. Now, whether that's who Warren meant or not, I don't know, but that's how Grant took it. And I believe that's how Warren meant it, because he wrote a letter that night. It's in the Warren papers in Albany. And he said, he wrote to his wife, and he said, "I've run up against General Grant. You must be prepared to see me disgraced, but I would do it again." He felt that that's what he owed. Well, Grant, I believe, decided he was going to get Warren for what Warren had done. Warren had said something he didn't want said. This is the instrument of Warren's destruction, General Philip H. Sheridan. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. Petersburg campaign is proceeding. Grant is again trying to find a way to break the deadlock. Now, he has far more resources of manpower than Lee does. So what he does is keep extending his line, keep feeling for the Confederate right, keep forcing Lee to attenuate his lines, hoping he'll find a spot he can make a breakthrough. And he uses his cavalry commander, Philip H. Sheridan, actually Meade's cavalry commander, but Grant is an overall command. He's out there extending the line, and he comes across what apparent opportunity at Five Forks. He fights a battle with Confederate forces there. It doesn't go terribly well, but it doesn't go badly, and it looks like he's found a place where there may be a chance for a breakthrough. So he sends a message to Grant. Now, I'm not going to go into details of all this because it's in the book, but Grant would claim that he and Sheridan had a secret plan, known only to them, to end the war. Nobody else knew, not any on Grant's staff, nobody else. I discussed why this doesn't make sense in the book, but one of the reasons is because when Sheridan reports, "Okay, I found a place to make the breakthrough, I need infantry support, send me the Sixth Corps." Grant says, "Well, they're not available, I'll send you the Fifth Corps." That Sheridan and Warren don't like each other. If this was part of some grand plan, one of the things that's wrong with it is, why wouldn't they have the unit there that Sheridan and Grant most trusted? Instead, they had Warren. Warren was ordered originally to travel across the White Oak Road and link up with Sheridan. The problem is there were Confederates on it, and he couldn't. He had been in combat that day. He had to disengage. By the way, there had been 3 days of torrential rain. He had to make a wide swing south, as the map shows, bridge 2 streams, and then link up with Sheridan. This is what he's faced with. Next slide, please. Okay, he makes the link up, and Sheridan gives him his orders. This is Warren's command on the right, the 3 units on the right there. And he's told this is very densely wooded terrain. He is told by Sheridan the Confederates are directly in front of you, attack through the woods. Warren starts to do that and realizes the Confederates are not in front of him. All the fighting's to his left. He has to ride into the woods himself, locate his troops, and redirect them. And it works. He winds up rolling up the Confederate flank, actually coming in on their rear at one point, and the Battle of Five Forks is a decisive Union victory. And as soon as it's over, Sheridan is relieved of his command. Excuse me, Warren. Sheridan relieves Warren of his command. Pardon my misstep there. Warren sends a messenger, asking what are your orders, and he's told, orders hell. General Warren was not in the fight. Tell him he's relieved of his command. Warren sends a messenger back, asks him to reconsider, and Sheridan's response is, reconsider hell. I don't reconsider my orders. Okay, so why? Well, historians have attributed this to Sheridan's notoriously fiery temper. Grant said in his memoirs that he regretted that this had happened. It was a shame. It's really too bad. Well, that's okay, except in that case, why didn't he correct it? This is April 1st, 1865. The war's going to be over within 2 weeks. Warren requests a court of inquiry. Grant won't grant him one. Meade sends a message to Grant and said that the 5th Corps needs a commander. I would not object if you were to reappoint General Warren. Grant doesn't do it. Warren requests a court of inquiry. He should have had one by Army regulations within 30 days. It took him 18 years to get one. Next slide, please. Okay. Why take so long? Well, Grant was general-in-chief and refused him. Then Grant was interim secretary of war and refused it. Then Grant was president for 2 terms and basically laid down the law. He's not going to get a court of inquiry. Then Sherman is general-in-chief, Grant's best friend, and Sherman denies it. And everybody knows that the next general-in-chief of the Army is going to be Phil Sheridan, the man who relieved him of command in the first place. Finally, Rutherford B. Hayes, who didn't particularly like Grant, ordered the court of inquiry. It took place on Governor's Island in New York Harbor. 81 days of testimony, but it was dragged out over 18 months because Grant and Sheridan kept just taking their time, producing witnesses, producing documents. Why did they drag it out? Because Warren was dying of diabetes. Next slide, please. Charges were, Warren had been slow in his night march and failed to reach his position by the appointed hour of midnight. We'll take these one at a time. Again, there's more detail in the book. That having reached the vicinity of Five Forks, he was slow putting his troops into action. That he didn't follow Sheridan's orders for the attack. That during the attack, he didn't exercise adequate control. That he permitted one of his divisions to break and did not exert himself to inspire the men, and that he ignored a direct order from the general-in-chief of the Army. Next slide, please. Okay. One of the things that Warren had to do, besides breaking contact with the enemy, his men hadn't eaten in 2 days. They had to make a forced march through the dark. And there's no electrical lights. This is pitch black. It's pouring rain. This is Gravelly Run. I took this photograph in a very dry August when it was not really much of a stream. He had to ford it after 3 days of heavy rain. One of Sheridan's engineers described it as a raging torrent. It was not fordable. You could not wade across this thing. What he had to do, his men had to do, in the dark, was break down a house and a barn, dismantle them, rebuild a bridge over the stream because the Confederates had burned the bridge, and then get across it. Next slide, please. These are the kind of roads he had to take. These are actually roads in that area today. Now, much of the area is paved, but some of it isn't. And again, this was after 3 days of heavy rain during a torrential downpour. One of Sheridan's cavalry officers who had been on that same road said that the horses sank into the mud up to their fetlock. That'd be like you going up to your knees. It was just awful. Sheridan's own officers described the roads as awful. But supposedly Warren took too long getting there. Next slide, please. Okay. But he did get there. And what's interesting is that a staff officer whom Sheridan sent to meet him, was surprised at how far along they'd come. When he approached the head of Warren's column, he said, I didn't expect you to be anywhere near this point. Sheridan when Warren arrives, doesn't seem to be upset. He's not angry. Supposedly, if he relieves Warren because he's late getting there, he should have been raging. And the first question should have been, where the hell have you been? He never asked any questions. He orders the Fifth Corps to stand down until he's ready for them. Tells them, go ahead and make breakfast. I'll send for you and I'm ready. So why is Warren to blame for being slow putting his troops into action when Sheridan told him to wait here? Next slide, please. Okay, Sheridan claimed Warren issued orders that were at odds with what he wanted done, except multiple witnesses, including some of Sheridan's own staff, saw Warren copy a map Sheridan drew on the ground. He copied on a piece of paper, showed it to Sheridan, and said, yes, that's correct. Sheridan dictated the orders, Warren wrote them down, showed them to Sheridan, Warren approved them. But supposedly he didn't follow Sheridan's orders. Well, if Sheridan didn't approve of the orders that Warren wrote, he certainly had an opportunity to correct them. Next slide, please. That he didn't exercise adequate control. But as I showed you before, Warren had to go out and redirect his troops because he had been given incorrect military intelligence as to the position of the Confederates by Sheridan. Next slide, please. Permitted one of his divisions to break. Okay, yes, one of his divisions did break, but they rallied. They were rallied by Warren and attacked with, according to the testimony, well, I shouldn't say testimony, according to a letter. This officer was dead by the time of the Warren Court of Inquiry. You may be familiar with his name, George Armstrong Custer of Sheridan's command. He said in a letter that he saw Warren leading the final charge on horseback with his corps colors in his hand. And yet he permitted one of his divisions to break and did not make any effort to inspire them, according to Sheridan. Next slide, please. Sheridan's testimony included the following exchange. The question is by Albert Stickney, who was Warren's attorney at the Court of Inquiry. As far as I understand, you had no knowledge at the time, this is after the relief, you had no knowledge at the time of what General Warren did do in this battle after you parted with him at the beginning of the attack. Sheridan, no, I had no knowledge. Nor did you make any inquiry to find out what he'd done. I didn't have time. You never asked him? No, I did not. And yet he relieved him of command for not following orders. And he just testified that he didn't know what Warren had done. Next slide, please. By the way, my office at the time I was working on this was a building called Stickney Hall. Yes, same guy. What a coincidence. Warren's final assault, which broke the back of the Confederate position. Next slide, please. Okay, this is an overview of the Five Forks today. As you can see, there's still not much there. That white building there is a visitor center. There's not too much to it. It was pretty desolate at the time and far more overgrown. Next slide, please. Okay, Sheridan's testimony. There was a message from Grant. This is the one that the message, the order that supposedly Warren disobeyed. That ordered Warren to be with Sheridan by midnight. Okay, there's a couple of problems with it. One of them is that there's no indication Warren was ever sent that message. It doesn't appear anywhere. The only two people who testified to its existence were Grant and Sheridan. Also, there's another problem. Not in the official records. Should be. Everything else is. Well, also, Grant said that he sent the message at one specific time, and Sheridan said he received it at another time, and the times don't make sense. I'll come back to that. But Sheridan's asked about this supposed message. Can you recollect whose handwriting it was? No, sir. Can you recollect what you did with the original? No, sir. When did you last see the original? I don't know. Have you any reason to believe the original is in existence anywhere? No, sir. Did you turn it over to the War Department? I don't know. And yet again, this is the basis for relieving an officer of his command. Next slide, please. Question asked of Grant. Okay, what happened was Grant sends a message to Sheridan, Warren's on the way, and yet Warren hasn't been ordered that. Then sends a message to Meade telling him to order Warren. So Grant is asked, why did you send the message to Sheridan, Warren was on the way, before you send the message to Meade telling him to send Warren? It doesn't make sense. That's backwards. Next slide. Grant's response. Could you be any more indistinct here. I think there was a little delay of half an hour caused in that way before sending the message to General Warren. I think there was a little delay in sending General Warren his orders in consequence of that. I think that I did, as I've stated, but I will not be sure about that. I think there was a delay of that sort in sending General Warren his orders, which I did not know of at the time I went to General Sheridan. I think there was a delay long enough for General Meade to come to my headquarters to see me in person. Yes, I could not state it positively, but I have an indistinct recollection that there was a delay in that way. Okay, a couple things. Meade's dead by this time, so they can't call him to testify one way or the other. Secondly, the movement was ordered at the suggestion of Meade. Warren sent a message to Meade suggesting this movement, and Meade forwarded it to Grant. Why then would Meade bother to mount up and ride to Grant in person to question an order that he himself had suggested? It doesn't make any sense. Next slide, please. Grant volunteered to take a stand. He wasn't subpoenaed. He testified Warren disobeyed a direct order. Warren was acquitted of all charges. Indications are that the order from Grant never existed. Now, here's the problem. Sheridan and Grant both testified that that order was sent. They're the only two people who did. Sheridan named an officer who carried it. He was called to testify. He said he did not carry that order. He made that ride from Grant's headquarters to Sheridan's headquarters once that night, earlier, much earlier, and it took him 2 hours. Another officer was suggested, this time by Sheridan, his brother, Michael, as the courier. He was called to testify. Sheridan's own brother said, I did not carry that message. I did ride from those headquarters that night to carry a message a unit would be sent, but it had not been decided yet that it was going to be the Fifth Corps. They eventually named somebody who was conveniently dead and couldn't be called to testify. But here's a big problem. Forsyth, the first officer, testified it took him 2 hours to make the ride. Michael Sheridan, the second officer, testified that riding at what he called a dangerously reckless pace took him an hour and a half. And yet, if we were to believe the time Grant said he sent the order and the time Sheridan said he received it, Kellogg, the officer they named, would have had to make the same ride in 15 minutes. It wasn't possible. And if nobody carried the order, then there was no order. And if there was no order, then there was no basis for the relief of Warren. Not only that, Sheridan and Grant both said under oath that the order had been sent. If they're lying under oath, that is perjury. And there is no documentation to support what they said. Warren was acquitted of all charges, and that took a lot of courage, because remember, all the officers on this court-martial are serving officers, active duty, and they're testifying in a case where they know the result that former President Grant and General-in-Chief Sherman want. They want Warren convicted, and everybody knows Sheridan's going to be the next General-in-Chief, and yet these officers acquitted Warren of all charges. The findings, however, were held by the order of Sherman until after Warren's death. He never knew his reputation had been restored. He was buried with no military honors. Among his last words were, I die a disgraced soldier, and his wife was ordered to vacate base housing. Next slide, please. This is very briefly on two appendices from the book. After book one went to press, a few things turned up that I wish I'd had before. An officer who was at Shiloh pointed something out. Grant gets credit for the victory at Shiloh, and he was the Army commander. But this officer who was there said Grant did not give a single order that moved on day one that moved a division, a brigade, or a regiment. He rode to where Prentice was holding the Hornet's Nest, said hold his position at all hazards, and then left. And when Don Carlos Buell and his army arrived, he said he found Grant in a gunboat in the middle of the Tennessee River. That's not the image that I've always had of Grant at Shiloh. And yet, he doesn't get blamed for leaving the front, and Rosecrans does at Chickamauga. Another officer, speaking of the Battle of Belmont, again, a witness. Belmont was supposed to be a reconnaissance and force. It was Grant's really first exercise of independent command. Grant, against orders, turned it into an attack. It was at first successful, but he attacked a much larger Confederate force and was fortunate to manage to extricate his troops at all. This officer pointed something out. Grant told the story, as far as this guy could find, at least 11 times, and it was different every time. The first version of it was a very near thing we almost really suffered a serious defeat. And he kept getting better as it went along, until finally by the end, it was a noteworthy victory. Also, this officer said, one of the most well-remembered aspects of the Battle of Belmont is Grant, who supposedly is one of the best horsemen of his graduating class at West Point, after the last of his men were aboard the transports, was the last man to board by riding his horse, very daredevil style, up a single plank. This guy says, nobody else mentions that at all. You would think there'd be hundreds of eyewitnesses who would testify to that, but only Grant says it. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I will take questions. If you bring the last slide up, if you wouldn't mind. If anyone has any questions for me, or if you'd like an autographed copy of the book, I know they sell the book there in the museum. If you'd like an autographed copy, you can send an email to my Gmail account and we can arrange that. But okay, questions. I am ready for your questions. As I mentioned, by the way, there's a lot more information in the books. I skipped over a lot of the details here. Okay, I can't hear you, Doug.
Sorry about that. Is there any evidence of Grant being in Racine, Wisconsin at any time?
I haven't really looked into that, so I couldn't say.
Okay. Have you given this talk in Galena, Frank?
I have not. I haven't invited. This book, the second book, only came out in May, and I have been all over the place. The week after it came out, I was in Chicago. I'm not at the Chicago, at one of the suburban Civil War roundtables. I've had at least one event a month since scheduled from then until this coming August. This month I have 3. This is the second of them. So I've been around, but no, I haven't been invited to Galena yet. Or the Grant House there.
Is there anything about Grant that you found admirable, or that through your research?
Yes. First of all, Grant was a bulldog. He did have tenacity. He was persistent. Unfortunately, that also, according to a couple of Civil War generals, led to casualties that were avoidable. They said, one of them said his desire to constantly constantly be doing something, meant that he often didn't plan things out as thoroughly as he could. However, he was probably the general the Union needed at that point. Also, I find for a guy whose presidential administration was about one of the most corrupt in U.S. history, there's really not much personal scandal attached to Grant. He appears to have been a very loving husband and father, a good family man. So there are things I find admirable about Grant. The problem I have with him is this pattern of deceit that keeps turning up, and this insistence that if anything went wrong, it was never his fault. I mean, heck, I've worked for people like that. Probably almost everybody there today knows somebody like that. It's never their fault. And that seems to be the case with Grant. If something goes wrong, it was always become some subordinate let him down. He never seemed willing to take responsibility. And some people have said, well, yes, he did. He took responsibility for the mistake of launching the failed charge at Cold Harbor. Not really. He used passive voice. What he said was, one of my great regrets is that the last charge at Cold Harbor was made. Okay, that's nice. Except it would have been much more honest for him to have said, one of my great regrets is that I ordered the final charge at Cold Harbor against the advice of the Corps commanders on the scene, Winfield, Scott Hancock, and Gouverneur Kemble Warren. And so again, he didn't really take responsibility for it. He used passive voice in that case to kind of duck. Mistakes were made, as Ted Kennedy said. Ted Kennedy, rather.
Yes, we got time for one more.
Greatly admire your tenacity, scholarship, for seeking the facts about things that have been being illusions. Have you, as a result of your book, had any critiques from other historians about information you've used or not used as a result of this tenacity scholarship? I'll
try to paraphrase, Frank. Congratulations on your tenacity. What has been the response from other historians about your sources, than what you've come up with, challenging claims, etc.?
Generally speaking, quite positive. Most of the negative responses that I have gotten, with one exception, there was one historian who didn't take it at all well, and I talk about that in the preface to the book too. And the funny thing is, I was doing a presentation in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania once, and one of the people in the crowd stuck around afterwards, and he asked me who this historian was, and I said, well, I don't want to say his name, and he said the name, and he said, he's my cousin, and he's something of a jerk. I don't give his name in the book, and I'm not going to do it here. He was the only person who really seemed to be quite negative about it. As a matter of fact, one of the people who came in for a lot of criticism in book one was Edward Bunkemper. And he wrote a really, really nice review of the first book. He's unfortunately deceased now. But he said, he began the review by saying, in this superb book, and then he went on to note my criticisms and acknowledge when he thought he was wrong. Vince Dooley, who's besides being a football coach, was a Civil War historian, told me I was, and I'm quoting him here, doing God's work and setting the record straight. There has been sort of a new wave of historians, of which I was, even though I'm old, I was one of the kind of the lead, among the leaders of, not because everybody followed after me. I just happened to go into one of the first two or three to get my book out. Myself, Diane Monroe Smith, her book on the Overland Campaign got out a couple months ahead of my book. David Moore, his biography of Rosecrans, came out a couple months after mine. And since then, a number of other people, Rob Girardi, Philip Lee, Joe Rose, Paula Walker, quite a few people, Dave Powell, have been looking at Grant in a new light. And not necessarily a favorable one. I don't think an unfair one. Phil Lee focuses on his presidency. Joe Rose, basically, he had a much more expansive book than I wrote, called Grant Under Fire. He looks at Grant's entire career. I focus basically on his relationship with these specific Civil War generals. I start with the Battle of Belmont and go on through the end of the war. But generally speaking, it's been quite common. The only people who've been really upset by it are generally Civil War buffs, for the most part, who are admirers of Grant, and like many people, when they have a politician whom they support wholeheartedly, will not brook any criticism of that person. They like Grant. One guy who criticized me on Facebook, his cognomen was Grant Guy, which gives you right up front, he's pretty much honest about where he stood. I've had people say to me, well, you're wrong. And I'll say, well, how do you know I'm wrong? Because I read it in the book. Well, what book did I read it in? My book. Well, yeah, that's one of the books I discussed in my book. Did you read my book? No, I'm not going to. Okay, well then, when you've read it, talk to me.
Well,
But
Frank,
generally speaking, it's been quite positive.
Great.
Thank you.
well, thank you so much for agreeing to join us virtually. We hope to get you out to Kenosha sometime in the near future, please.
I'd like to do that. Yeah, unfortunately, during the academic year, it's difficult for me to travel.
Correct. I'm going to spin you around so you can see everybody, but thanks again, and we'll sign off.
Hi, thanks, folks. Thanks for being here. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks, everybody. Hope to see you at an upcoming event, either the medical weekend towards the end of February or Terry Arliskis's program in March. So take care and drive safe. Thank you, Frank.
Thanks, Doug. I really appreciate it.